I'm 68 years old and my name is Henrietta. I spent 40 years as a dedicated teacher in the Maine public school system before retiring to enjoy my golden years. The lakeside country house that had been in my family for generations was meant to be my sanctuary. Instead, it became the center of the most painful betrayal I've ever experienced. When my only son Thomas looked me in the eye and said those words, I felt my heart shatter. But sometimes the quietest revenge is the sweetest. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. If you've ever felt betrayed by family, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how I turned the tables when they least expected it. The country house sits on 3 acres of wooded lakefront property just outside of Camden, Maine. My grandfather built it with his own hands back in 1932 during the hardest years of the Depression. He was a carpenter who believed in building things to last, and that house was his masterpiece. The foundation stones were hauled from a local quarry. The beams were hand-hewn oak, and every window was positioned to capture either the morning light or the sunset over the lake. My earliest memories are tied to that house. Every summer from when I was 4 years old, my parents would pack up our station wagon and we'd make the drive from our primary home in Portland to spend 3 glorious months by the lake. I remember running barefoot across the wooden dock, jumping into the cold, clear water and gathering wild blueberries with my mother to make pies in the old cast-iron oven. When my grandfather passed away in 1965, he left the house to my father, who treated it with the same reverent care. Dad added a screened porch where we'd play cards during summer thunderstorms, listening to the rain patter on the metal roof while staying perfectly dry. Mom planted a garden that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. It was her small paradise, she would say. After college, I introduced Frank, my then fiancé, to the lake house. He fell in love with it immediately, just as I'd hoped he would. After we married in 1979, we spent our honeymoon there. Frank being handy like my grandfather took to maintaining the house with dedication. He replaced the roof in '85, updated the plumbing in '92, and added subtle modern conveniences while preserving the rustic character that made the place special. When my parents passed away within months of each other in 2001, the house came to me. By then, our son Thomas was in college studying finance at Boston University. He'd grown up spending his summers at the lake house too, learning to fish with his father, hosting bonfires with local friends, and eventually bringing his high school girlfriends to impress them with the private beach. The local community around the lake house was tight-knit. Our neighbor Martha Wilson had the adjacent property for nearly as long as our family had owned ours. Her children had grown up alongside Thomas. Old Jim Cooper ran the general store 2 miles down the road and knew exactly how I took my coffee. The Petersons, who ran the local historical society, would often stop by to chat about preservation efforts in the area. After Frank died in 2015 from a sudden heart attack, the lake house became more than just a vacation property to me. It became my sanctuary, my connection to everyone I'd loved and lost. I retired from teaching the following year and made plans to move there permanently. The Portland house held too many painful memories of Frank's absence. At the lake, somehow I could feel his presence in the gardens he'd tended and the workshop where his tools still hung in perfect order. Thomas would visit occasionally, though less frequently than before. He was building his career at a financial firm in Boston, working long hours and climbing the corporate ladder. I noticed his attitude toward the house had shifted subtly. Where once he'd spoken of bringing his own children there someday, he now made comments about how much work it must be to maintain such an old place. Still, I never imagined what was coming. How could I? He was my son, the boy who had Frank's eyes and my stubborn chin, the child I had raised to value family above all else. Thomas graduated with honors from Boston University and landed a prestigious position at Wellington Financial Group. He worked insane hours, often sleeping at the office during his first few years, but his dedication paid off. By 30, he was one of their top financial analysts with an office overlooking Boston Harbor and a salary that would have made his father incredibly proud. It was at a charity gala for the Boston Symphony that Thomas met Lisa Harrington. She came from the kind of old New England money that doesn't need to announce itself, but her family did anyway. Her father, Gerald, had expanded the family's real estate development business, while her mother, Margaret, chaired half a dozen prestigious charity boards. When Thomas first brought Lisa to dinner at my Portland home, I noticed how her eyes cataloged everything: the furniture, the artwork, even my clothing. She was undeniably beautiful with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and the kind of polished appearance that comes from a lifetime of privilege. But when Thomas proudly showed her the photo albums of his childhood at the lake house, she merely smiled tightly and asked if we had updated the rustic decor. I should have recognized that first warning sign, but I wanted so badly for Thomas to be happy. Frank had been gone just 2 years, and seeing Thomas excited about his future gave me something positive to focus on. Their courtship was brief and expensive. Thomas bought Lisa a 3-carat diamond engagement ring that I later learned had put him into significant debt despite his good salary. When he asked if I could help with the wedding costs, I agreed without hesitation. Frank had left a solid life insurance policy, and I wanted to honor what he would have done for his son. The wedding was at the Harrington family's country club in the Berkshires, an affair for 300 guests, most of whom I'd never met. I contributed nearly $70,000, which Lisa's mother informed me barely covered the flowers and band. I sat in the front row next to an empty seat that should have held Frank and tried to focus on Thomas's happiness rather than the Harringtons' obvious display of wealth. Gerald Harrington was a tall, imposing man with a booming voice who seemed to treat everything like a business negotiation. During the rehearsal dinner, he cornered me to discuss what legacy assets I planned to leave to the children, though Thomas and Lisa had not yet even discussed having a family. Margaret Harrington was more subtle but equally presumptuous, asking detailed questions about my lake house property while making dismissive comments about its quaint, outdated charm. After the honeymoon, a month-long tour of European capitals, I began to notice changes in Thomas. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then sporadic. He and Lisa bought a penthouse condominium in Boston's Seaport District with a mortgage that made me wince when he mentioned the amount. When I expressed concern about taking on so much debt, he brushed it off with financial jargon that seemed designed to end the conversation. I tried my best to build a relationship with Lisa. I invited them to the lake house for weekends, sent thoughtful gifts on holidays, and always remembered her birthday with a handwritten card. Lisa's responses were polite but distant. She always had a reason why they couldn't visit work commitments, social obligations with her family renovation projects at their condo. It was during a Thanksgiving dinner at the Harringtons' Boston brownstone that I first heard Lisa mention the lake house to her parents in a way that unsettled me. I was helping in the kitchen when Lisa and her mother walked in, not noticing me behind the massive refrigerator door. Thomas says the property must be worth a fortune now, especially with lakefront values skyrocketing, Lisa was saying. It's just sitting there most of the year, such a waste. Has he discussed your plans for it? Margaret asked. Not yet. He says his mother is sentimental about it, but I've been working on him. It would make a perfect summer place for you and Daddy. So much better than that crowded resort in the Hamptons. They moved on to another topic when they noticed me, but the seed of worry had been planted. On the drive back to Maine the next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was brewing. The following months brought a noticeable increase in Thomas and Lisa's interest in the lake house. Thomas called to ask detailed questions about the property taxes, maintenance costs, and whether I had updated the insurance policy recently. Lisa sent emails with links to interior design websites suggesting that a refresh might make the place more enjoyable for everyone. During this time, Thomas became increasingly distant from me personally while becoming strangely interested in the logistics of the property. Our conversations felt like business transactions rather than family check-ins. Gone were the days when he would ask about my garden or the new book I was reading. Now it was all about the house, the property, the financial aspects of my retirement. When they finally came for a weekend visit in early spring, I was hopeful we might reconnect. Instead, I found myself increasingly anxious as I watched my daughter-in-law evaluate my family home like a real estate opportunity. The April morning that Thomas and Lisa arrived at the lake house unannounced started like any other day. I was in the garden turning over the soil for spring planting when their luxury SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. Thomas had never been one to drop by without calling first, so immediately I felt a flutter of concern. "Mom?" Thomas called with a wave that seemed too enthusiastic. Surprise visit Lisa had a break in her schedule, so we thought we'd drive up. Lisa emerged from the passenger side wearing designer boots entirely impractical for the muddy spring ground. "Henrietta, how lovely to see you working in the garden. So quaint and therapeutic, isn't it?" Over coffee on the porch, Thomas cleared his throat and began what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "Mom, Lisa, and I have been thinking about the house. It's such a special place, but it must be so much work for you to maintain on your own. Lisa jumped in. "We were thinking that maybe it's time to consider some upgrades, modernizing a bit. The kitchen is so vintage, and the bathrooms could use a complete overhaul." I set my coffee cup down carefully. The plumbing was updated about 15 years ago. Frank made sure everything was in good working order. Thomas avoided my eyes. "That's still a long time ago, Mom. And it's not just about function, it's about bringing the place into this century. We could help coordinate the renovations. Lisa has excellent taste and knows some top contractors." "And what would be the purpose of these renovations?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Well," Thomas said, shifting in his seat, "as you get older, you might want to simplify your life. Maybe consider something smaller, easier to manage. A nice condo in Portland, perhaps." The conversation continued in this vein through lunch. Lisa talked about unlocking the property's potential and creating a legacy space the whole family could enjoy. But it was increasingly clear that by family, she meant primarily her family. "My parents have been looking for a lake property for years," Lisa mentioned casually as she pushed her salad around her plate. "Nothing they've seen has the perfect location like this place. It's so hard to find good waterfront these days." I changed the subject, asking about their work and friends in Boston, but Lisa kept steering the conversation back to the house. After lunch, she asked for a proper tour, though she'd been through the house before. This time was different. She took photos with her phone in every room, asking about the age of fixtures, the condition of the roof, and whether I'd had the foundation inspected recently. At one point, I found her measuring the master bedroom with a small tape measure she'd produced from her purse. Thomas followed us but remained unusually quiet. When our eyes met, he would quickly look away or find something on his phone that suddenly required attention. It was the behavior of a man who knew he was participating in something shameful. After they left, I found an envelope of architectural drawings that had fallen from Lisa's bag. The plans showed a completely gutted and redesigned interior of my house with Harrington Lake House written across the top. The master suite had been labeled Gerald and Margaret's room. That evening, my neighbor Martha came by with a fresh loaf of banana bread. "Henrietta, I saw Thomas and that wife of his were here today," she said as we sat at my kitchen table. "Everything okay? Last week I noticed some people walking the property line with measuring tools when you were in Portland for your dental appointment." My heart sank. "What people, Martha?" "A man in a suit and what looked like a contractor. They were discussing something about setbacks and lake access regulations. I assumed you'd hired them, but they left when I came over to introduce myself." That night I lay awake in my bedroom, the same room where I'd slept as a child during summer vacations, the same room where Frank and I'd stayed during our honeymoon. The moonlight through the pine trees cast familiar patterns on the ceiling, but for the first time I felt like a stranger in my own family home. The next morning, I called Thomas at his office. He sounded startled to hear from me making excuses about being late for a meeting. Before he could hang up, I asked directly, "Thomas, are you and Lisa planning to take over the lake house?" There was a long pause before he replied, "We should discuss this in person, Mom. Can I take you to lunch next week?" His non-answer was answer enough. I agreed to meet him, then sat down to prepare myself for what I feared was coming. Portland's Old Port District was bustling with early summer tourists when I arrived at 4th Street, the upscale restaurant where Thomas had suggested we meet. He was already seated at a table in the back corner, partially hidden by a brick column, privacy for what would prove to be an uncomfortable conversation. Thomas stood to greet me, kissing my cheek stiffly. He looked every inch the successful financial analyst in his tailored suit, but the dark circles under his eyes suggested troubled sleep. He ordered an expensive bottle of wine without asking if I wanted any. "Mom, you're looking well," he began awkwardly, straightening his silverware with precision. "Let's not do the small talk, Thomas," I replied. "You asked me here for a reason. What's happening with the lake house?" He took a long sip of water, then another before setting the glass down with unusual care. "I've been meaning to discuss this with you for some time. You're getting older, and the house is too much responsibility. It sits empty most of the winter. The maintenance costs are significant. It makes financial sense to consider alternatives." "Alternatives like giving it to Lisa's parents?" I asked quietly. His eyes widened slightly before his professional mask returned. "It's not that simple, but yes, Gerald and Margaret have expressed interest in purchasing the property. Purchasing from whom, Thomas? The house belongs to me. Thomas cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. Well, that's not entirely accurate anymore. The waiter arrived with our appetizers, breaking the tension momentarily. As soon as he left, Thomas continued in a lower voice. Do you remember after Dad died, when I helped you organize his estate paperwork, there were some documents regarding the lake house that needed attention? A cold feeling spread through my chest. You mean the property tax forms you said you'd handle for me? Among other things, Thomas said. At the time, I added my name to the deed as a joint owner. It was the sensible thing to do to protect the asset and simplify the eventual inheritance process. The salmon mousse I'd been eating turned to ash in my mouth. You put your name on my house without telling me? That's not protection, Thomas. That's deception. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, but pressed on. The point is, as joint owner, I have the legal right to make decisions about the property, and Lisa's parents are prepared to make a very generous offer. So you're selling my house out from under me, the house your grandfather built where you spent every summer of your childhood. It's not that dramatic, Mom, he said, his tone becoming sharper. I'm being practical. Gerald and Margaret will give us fair market value. You could buy a nice condo in Portland, invest the rest, and be financially secure. And if I refuse, Thomas straightened his tie, a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father. That's why I wanted to have this conversation in person. The decision has actually already been made. What does that mean? My voice sounded distant to my own ears. The paperwork has been filed. Given my joint ownership, I have the legal authority to proceed. Gerald and Margaret are planning to move in next month after some initial renovations. I must have gone pale because Thomas quickly poured me a glass of water. Mom, this is for the best. You'll see. Their offer is more than generous. And if I don't want to sell, if I want to keep living in my home. Thomas's expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. He leaned forward and spoke in a voice I barely recognized. It's theirs now. You have no rights to go there. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's the reality. A strange calm settled over me, then replacing the initial shock. Thomas seemed taken aback by my lack of visible reaction. He had expected tears, anger, perhaps even begging. Instead, I simply took a sip of my water and asked, Is that all you wanted to tell me? Confusion flickered across his face. You're okay with this? Did I say that? I replied evenly. I said, Is that all? The rest of the lunch passed in awkward conversation. Thomas attempted to discuss the logistics of me moving my personal items out of the house while I asked about his work, Lisa's charity commitments, anything but the betrayal sitting between us like an unwelcome guest. On the drive home with the coastal highway stretching before me, I finally allowed the tears to come, not just for the house, but for the loss of the son I thought I knew. The boy who had helped Frank build a treehouse in the old oak by the lake. The teenager who had carved his initials into the boathouse door. The young man who had promised his father on his deathbed that he would always look after me. As I pulled into my driveway for only a few weeks more, I recalled the papers Thomas had asked me to sign shortly after Frank's funeral. Just some routine maintenance paperwork, Mom, he had said, sliding the documents across the kitchen table while I was still numb with grief. Dad would want us to make sure everything's properly sorted. I had signed without reading, trusting my son implicitly. That trust now felt like a luxury that I could no longer afford. That night, as I sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge over the lake, I made a decision. If Thomas thought his mother would simply roll over and accept this betrayal, he was about to learn otherwise. I might have been a high school English teacher for 40 years, but I had also been married to one of the shrewdest business minds in Portland, and Frank had taught me a thing or two about playing the long game. The next morning, I called Jacob Bernstein, who had been Frank's attorney and our family friend for over 30 years. Though semi-retired now, Jacob agreed to meet me for coffee that afternoon at his small home office in Camden. Henrietta, this is unconscionable, Jacob said after I explained the situation, but unfortunately not entirely unexpected from what I've observed of Thomas in recent years. Is there anything I can do legally? I asked. Thomas claims he has the right to sell because his name is on the deed. Jacob removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. It's complicated. Joint ownership does give him certain rights, but there are other factors to consider. When was the house built again? 1932. My grandfather built it himself. And it's never been substantially renovated or altered from the original structure. No. Frank updated some systems, but we were always careful to maintain the original character. Jacob made some notes. And you said it's on the lake with direct water access. I nodded, and Jacob's expression became thoughtful. There might be something here. Properties of that age, particularly waterfront ones, often have easements, covenants, or restrictions that may not be immediately obvious but could be legally binding. For the next week, I divided my time between the town clerk's office, the county records department, and the local historical society. Jacob helped me navigate the legal terminology, but it was Martha from the historical society who made the crucial discovery. Henrietta, look at this, she said one afternoon, carefully unfolding a brittle document from 1935. Your grandfather filed a conservation easement on the lakefront portion of the property. It was part of a larger effort to protect the watershed after some industrial pollution concerns. The easement, still legally binding, restricted development within 100 feet of the shoreline and prohibited removing more than 20% of the existing trees on the property. Further digging revealed a property covenant requiring that any substantial alterations to the house's exterior maintain its rustic Adirondack architectural character. Jacob was encouraged by these findings, but cautioned me that they might only restrict what the Harringtons could do with the property, not prevent the sale entirely. We need something more definitive, he said. It was during a routine inspection of the property tax records that we found our leverage. For the past 3 years, since adding his name to the deed, Thomas had been responsible for paying the property taxes, something he had assured me he was handling as a favor to simplify my finances. The records showed the payments were significantly in arrears, with penalties and interest accumulating. This is actually helpful to us, Jacob explained. Tax liens take precedence over almost everything else. At minimum, this gives us grounds to delay any transfer of ownership until the situation is resolved. With this information in hand, I began implementing a careful plan. First, I documented everything of value in the house, taking photographs and creating detailed inventories. Family heirlooms, artwork, and furniture that had been in the family for generations were quietly moved to Martha's garage for safekeeping. I hired a structural engineer ostensibly to assess some concerning cracks in the foundation, ensuring that his detailed report highlighting numerous minor but expensive-to-fix issues would be filed with the town building department, becoming part of the public record any diligent buyer would check. Next, I contacted the local utility companies. Given the house's age, I explained I was concerned about the electrical system's capacity and the well water's quality. Each inspection resulted in recommendations for significant upgrades that would be needed for safety and compliance reasons. Throughout this process, I maintained a facade of resigned acceptance whenever Thomas called. I understand, son, I would say. These things happen. I just want what's best for everyone. My apparent cooperation seemed to both relieve and unsettle Thomas. During one call, he awkwardly mentioned that Lisa's parents were planning to modernize extensively, and asked if I would mind removing some of the outdated fixtures before they arrived. Of course, I replied pleasantly. I'll take care of everything. Thomas's calls became more frequent as their move-in date approached. He seemed increasingly suspicious of my amenable attitude, perhaps expecting the heartbroken resistance that would have been natural. Instead, I continued to assure him that I was simply being practical about the situation. One afternoon, I spotted Lisa driving slowly past the house. She didn't stop or acknowledge me working in the front garden, but I could feel her eyes assessing the property. I waved cheerfully, causing her to accelerate away in apparent confusion. The final piece of my plan came together when Jacob discovered that my grandfather had registered the house with the State Historic Preservation Office back in the 1960s, a fact that had been overlooked for decades but never rescinded. This registration imposed additional restrictions on modifications to the property without proper approval processes. As the Harringtons' planned move-in date drew near, I methodically prepared the house. I removed all my personal belongings but left the furniture as Thomas had indicated they wanted to use much of it, for now. I thoroughly organized the shed and boathouse and left detailed instructions about the quirks of the old place, which faucets needed an extra turn, which windows stuck in humid weather. On my last official night in the house, I walked through each room, saying a private goodbye to the space that had held so many memories. But unlike what Thomas might have expected, these weren't tearful farewells. They were more like promises. Promises that this story wasn't yet finished. The next morning, I left the keys in the mailbox as Thomas had requested and checked into the Whitehall Inn in Camden, just 15 minutes away. And then I waited calm in the knowledge that sometimes justice doesn't require a confrontation, sometimes it simply requires patience. The Harringtons arrived on a perfect June morning, a small convoy consisting of their Mercedes sedan, Thomas and Lisa's Range Rover, and 2 moving trucks filled with additional furniture and personal items. From my discreet position at Martha's house next door, I watched through binoculars as Gerald and Margaret emerged from their car, gesturing expansively at their new property while the movers began unloading. Thomas looked tense, continuously checking his phone and glancing at the house as if expecting something to go wrong. Lisa was directing the movers with military precision, pointing out where each piece should go. Her parents walked the property boundary, likely already planning the extensive landscaping changes they had mentioned to Thomas. The first sign that things weren't proceeding as planned came when one of the movers tried to turn on the water at the main valve. Martha and I observed his confused expression as he tried again and again, eventually calling Gerald over to assess the situation. Shortly thereafter, another mover emerged from the house looking frustrated after attempting to activate the electrical panel. The generator they'd brought along was soon running, providing temporary power while Gerald made angry phone calls on the front porch. By mid-afternoon, a parade of local officials began arriving at the property. First came Ron Jenkins from the Water District, explaining that the water had been legally disconnected due to the property's protected status during any transition of ownership, a little-used regulation that Jacob had discovered and activated through his connections on the Utilities Board. Next arrived Sarah Peterson from the Historical Society, clipboard in hand, expressing concerns about the moving trucks containing contemporary furniture that might violate the historical designation covenants. She reminded Gerald that any significant changes would require committee approval, a process that typically took 3 to 6 months. Thomas was pacing the driveway, his phone pressed to his ear, likely trying to reach me. I had deliberately let my phone battery die that morning, leaving him without immediate answers. The real chaos began when Building Inspector Mike Donovan showed up responding to an anonymous tip about unpermitted renovation work. When Gerald protested that they hadn't even begun renovations, Mike produced the architectural plans that had mysteriously appeared at the town office, the very same plans that had fallen from Lisa's purse during their visit. These plans would require at least 7 different variances, Mike explained, flipping through the pages. Plus, you're in a watershed protection zone, a historical district, and subject to shoreland zoning. The approval process would take a minimum of 8 months, assuming the Conservation Board doesn't object. By late afternoon, the final blow came with the arrival of Cynthia Wong from the county tax assessor's office, who politely but firmly informed Gerald that the property had a significant tax lien due to 3 years of unpaid taxes. Until the $27,432 in back taxes, penalties, and interest was paid in full, the property could not legally change hands. It was at this moment that I decided to make my entrance. I drove up in my modest sedan, parking behind the line of official vehicles. Thomas spotted me immediately, his face cycling through relief, confusion, and then dawning suspicion. "Mom, what are you doing here? I've been trying to call you all day." "I'm sorry my phone died," I said pleasantly. "I just thought I should check if the Harringtons were settling in all right. Seems like quite a commotion." Gerald stormed over, his face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this? Your son assured us this property was ready for immediate occupancy and renovation." "Did he?" I replied, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the assembled officials. "That's strange, considering the historical preservation status, the conservation easements, and those tax liens. Thomas has always been aware of those complications." Thomas's face went pale. "Mom, what are you talking about? You never mentioned any of this." "Didn't I maintained my calm demeanor. "I assumed you knew, especially after you added your name to the deed and took over the tax payments. You did read all the paperwork thoroughly, didn't you? Just like you expected me to do when I was grieving your father's death." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Jacob's arrival. He introduced himself as my attorney and suggested we all move this discussion inside. The officials, sensing the family drama unfolding, made discreet exits after providing their contact information for further consultation. Inside the house, my house Jacob methodically laid out the legal realities of the situation: the historical designation that restricted renovations, the conservation easement that prevented the lakefront development the Harringtons had planned, the neighbor access rights that allowed Martha and 3 other property owners to use the shared dock, the tax liens that prevented a clean sale, and finally the structural issues identified by the engineering report that would require significant investment before any cosmetic renovations could even begin. "This is absurd," Lisa finally exploded. "Thomas told us this was a simple property transfer, that his mother was ready to downsize and move on." "Is that what he told you?" I asked quietly. "Interesting, because he told me I had no rights to the home my family has owned for 3 generations." The following hours were tense. The movers, sensing the conflict, stopped unloading and eventually left with instructions to return the following day. Margaret retreated to their car, refusing to participate in the vulgar confrontation. Gerald alternated between threatening legal action and attempting to negotiate directly with me, offering increasingly larger sums to make this problem go away. Throughout it all, Thomas remained mostly silent, the full weight of his miscalculation evident in his slumped shoulders and inability to meet my gaze. As evening approached, Jacob suggested we adjourn for the day to let everyone consider their positions. The Harringtons left for a hotel in Camden, Lisa, trailing behind her parents after shooting Thomas a look of pure venom. When it was just Thomas and me in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had taught him to make pancakes shaped like animals when he was 7, he finally spoke. "You planned all this." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered simply. "Why didn't you just tell me you didn't want to sell? Why go through all this orchestration?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to see past the stranger he had become to find the boy I had raised. "Would you have listened when I expressed concern about the house? You told me I had no rights to be here. You made that decision without me behind my back, so I made my own decisions accordingly." Thomas stared out the window at the lake, now golden in the evening light. "I really messed up, didn't I?" "Yes," said you did. "Can it be fixed?" His voice sounded younger suddenly, reminding me of the little boy who would ask the same question when he broke one of his toys. "That depends," I replied, "on what you mean by fixed." Over the next few weeks, a new reality emerged. The Harringtons withdrew their offer, unwilling to deal with the complications or wait through the lengthy approval processes for their planned renovations. Lisa's parents barely spoke to Thomas, blaming him entirely for the embarrassing situation. Thomas and I had several long, difficult conversations, the kind we should have had before any of this happened. I learned about his financial pressures, the lifestyle expectations from Lisa and her family, and how he had convinced himself that selling the lake house was the practical solution to multiple problems. None of this excused his actions, but it helped me understand them. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, but it's often the first step toward it. As a solution, I proposed creating a family trust to hold the property. The trust would ensure the house remained in the family across generations, with clear guidelines about usage and maintenance. Thomas would have access and eventually pass it to his children if he had any, but the house could never be sold without unanimous agreement from all trust beneficiaries. "You're being more generous than I deserve," Thomas admitted when Jacob presented the trust documents. "This isn't about what you deserve," I told him. "It's about preserving what matters. The house is part of our family history. I won't let one bad decision erase that." Lisa filed for divorce 6 months later, citing Thomas's financial irresponsibility and family entanglements as irreconcilable differences. Thomas moved back to Portland, taking a less prestigious but less demanding position at a local investment firm. He started coming to the lake house on weekends, gradually repairing not just some of the physical maintenance that had been neglected, but also slowly our relationship. As for me, I continued living in my family home, watching the seasons change across the lake just as they had throughout my life. The experience changed me too. I became more vigilant about my affairs, more assertive in my decisions. I joined the board of the Historical Society and helped establish a program to assist older homeowners in navigating the legal complexities of property preservation. One evening, the following summer, Thomas and I sat on the dock watching the sunset just as we had countless times before. "I'm sorry," he said, not for the first time. "I don't know if I can ever make it up to you." "It's not about making it up to me," I replied. "It's about learning and growing, about understanding that family legacy isn't just about property or money. It's about integrity, respect, and honesty." Thomas nodded, looking out over the water. "Dad would have been proud of how you handled this. Not backing down, but not losing yourself to bitterness either. Your father always said that the true measure of a person isn't whether they get knocked down." I smiled. "It's what they do next." As the last light faded from the sky, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing since Frank's death. The house would remain where it belonged in our family, and perhaps more importantly, my son was finding his way back to the values that mattered most. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating others, but in standing firmly for what's right while leaving the door open for reconciliation, in protecting what matters without losing yourself to anger, in finding the balance between justice and mercy that allows healing to begin. Have you ever had to stand up to family who tried to take advantage of you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life experiences. And remember, sometimes the quietest strength speaks the loudest. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the courage to protect what matters most to you.